almost shed a tear and said, just like any band, we're having a career difference here. We're having a musical difference. And we're good.
The moment everything changed didn't come with a loud announcement or dramatic farewell. It arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, hidden behind interviews, rumors, and carefully worded statements that never quite told the full story. To the world, the split seemed sudden, even shocking, because the chemistry between David Lee Roth and Van Halen looked unstoppable. They weren't just successful, they were explosive, redefining what rock performance could be with swagger, excess, and a sense of rebellion that felt larger than life. But beneath the electrifying stage presence and the roaring crowds, something subtle had already begun to shift. It wasn't just about music anymore. It was about control, direction, and two completely different visions of what the future should look like. And those visions were drifting further apart with every passing tour, every recording session, every decision that forced compromise where none was wanted. The center of it all was a personality too big to be contained. Roth wasn't just a frontman. He was a spectacle, a storyteller, a ringmaster who transformed concerts into theatrical events. He thrived on spontaneity, on risk, on pushing boundaries that made even his own bandmates uneasy. Meanwhile, behind the guitar wizardry of Eddie Van Halen, there was a different ambition forming. One rooted in musical experimentation, precision, and a desire to evolve beyond the party-driven image that had defined them. At first, the contrast seemed like a strength, a perfect balance between chaos and control. But over time, it became friction. Creative disagreements grew more frequent, conversations more tense, and the unspoken question began to hover over every decision. Who was really steering the ship? The success only intensified the pressure. When you're selling out arenas and dominating charts, the stakes grow higher, and so do the expectations. Roth saw opportunity everywhere. Film projects, solo ventures, new artistic directions that extended beyond the band. He wanted to expand the brand, to turn his persona into something cinematic and unpredictable. But for the rest of the group, especially Eddie, the focus remained on refining the sound, exploring new musical territories, and maintaining cohesion. Neither vision was wrong, but they were incompatible. The more Roth pushed outward, the more the others pulled inward, and the gap widened into something impossible to ignore. Behind closed doors, discussions became negotiations. What started as creative debate slowly transformed into a struggle for identity. Was the band about wild energy and charisma, or about musical innovation and evolution? Could both coexist indefinitely, or was a breaking point inevitable? Roth began to feel constrained, as though the very platform that made him famous was now limiting the scope of what he wanted to become. At the same time, the band felt the need for stability, for focus, for a direction that didn't rely entirely on unpredictability. It was a classic collision of personalities, brilliant, passionate, and unwilling to bend too far. And then came the realization that changed everything. It wasn't just about disagreements. It was about independence. Roth didn't want to share the spotlight anymore. He wanted to redefine it. He envisioned himself stepping into a project that would blur the lines between music, film, and performance art. The band, meanwhile, envisioned a future that demanded unity and musical experimentation without constant distraction. The split, when it finally happened, felt abrupt to fans, but internally it had been building for months, perhaps even years. It wasn't fueled by one argument or one decision. It was a culmination of diverging ambitions that could no longer exist under the same banner. What makes the story so compelling is how simple the core reason actually was. It wasn't just ego, though ego played its part. It wasn't just creative tension, though that was undeniable. It was a desire for control over destiny. Roth wanted the freedom to chase ideas without compromise, to craft a narrative entirely his own. And in that pursuit, staying within the band, no matter how successful, became a limitation rather than an advantage. For someone whose identity was built on pushing boundaries, that realization left only one possible outcome. When the announcement finally reached the public, it sparked confusion, speculation, and endless debate. Fans tried to piece together clues, analyzing interviews, reading between the lines, searching for a dramatic catalyst. But the truth was quieter, almost philosophical. It was about direction. It was about ownership of creative identity. It was about a frontman who refused to let success define his limits. And while the aftermath reshaped both Roth's career and the band's future, that core reason remained the same. He left because he wanted complete creative freedom. Nothing more, nothing less. Looking back now, the split feels inevitable, almost destined. The energy that made them legendary also made them unstable, a fusion too intense to last forever. Yet that intensity is exactly what cemented their legacy. Without it, the story wouldn't carry the same weight, the same intrigue, the same lingering question of what might have been. And perhaps that's the most fascinating part of all. Sometimes the reason behind a monumental decision isn't complicated at all. Sometimes it's simply one person choosing independence over collaboration, vision over compromise, and risk over certainty. And once you understand that, once you see the split not as chaos but as clarity, you realize something profound. The departure wasn't just an ending. It was the inevitable result of a man determined to follow his own path, no matter how uncertain it seemed. And in that moment, the history of rock changed forever, leaving fans to wonder whether the magic was in the music, the personalities, or the tension that existed between them all along. And as the dust slowly settled, what followed was not just a separation, but a ripple effect that reshaped the entire landscape of rock music. The departure didn't simply remove a voice from a band. It altered the chemistry, the identity, and the momentum that had once seemed unstoppable. For years, audiences had associated the explosive energy, the flamboyant charisma, and the unpredictable stage presence with a unified force. Suddenly, that force was divided, and both sides were left to prove that their brilliance could exist independently. It was a high-stakes gamble, one that carried the risk of redefining not only careers, but legacies that eye in the immediate aftermath. Speculation ran wild. Some believed the split would weaken both sides, that the magic only existed when all the pieces were together. Others saw it as an opportunity, a chance for each creative mind to flourish without compromise. And perhaps that uncertainty added even more drama to the moment, because no one truly knew what would come next. Roth stepped into his solo ambitions with confidence, embracing theatricality and experimentation, determined to show that his departure was not an escape but a deliberate evolution. Meanwhile, the band focused inward, channeling their energy into redefining their sound, proving that musical innovation could stand on its own. But what's remarkable is how the narrative continued to evolve long after the initial shock faded. With each new project, each interview, each performance, the story gained new layers. Fans dissected every lyric, every decision, searching for hidden meanings, for confirmation of what really drove the separation. But the deeper truth remained consistent. It was about autonomy. It was about a frontman who believed that the next chapter of his career required stepping beyond the framework that had made him famous. That decision, while risky, was also incredibly bold. Walking away from massive success is never easy, but doing so in pursuit of creative independence requires a level of conviction that few are willing to embrace. Over time, hindsight began to reshape the narrative. The split was no longer viewed solely as a conflict, but as a turning point that allowed both sides to grow in different directions. It highlighted how creative partnerships, even the most powerful ones, sometimes reach a natural conclusion, not because they fail, but because they evolve. And in that sense, the departure wasn't just a break. It was a transformation. It forced everyone involved to redefine themselves, to explore new boundaries, and to confront the question of identity outside the comfort of familiarity. Though there's also an emotional layer that often goes unnoticed. Beneath the headlines and speculation, there was a shared history, years of touring, recording, and building something extraordinary together. Walking away from that is never purely strategic. It carries weight, memories, and a quiet understanding that things will never be quite the same again. Yet sometimes, that very awareness is what drives change. The recognition that staying might preserve the past, but leaving could create something entirely new. For Roth, that realization became the defining factor, the moment where certainty about independence outweighed the comfort of collaboration. That as decades passed, the story continued to be revisited, reinterpreted, and debated. Interviews revealed fragments, perspectives shifted, and the mythology surrounding the split grew even larger. But at its core, the explanation remained surprisingly straightforward. It wasn't one dramatic fight, one betrayal, or one sudden impulse. It was the accumulation of ambition, personality, and vision converging into a single, inevitable decision. He didn't leave because he had to. He left because he chose to. And that distinction is what makes the story so compelling. Because in the world of music, where success often encourages stability, choosing uncertainty is rare. It means embracing the unknown, risking failure, and trusting that individuality is worth more than guaranteed triumph. That is a thread that runs through the entire narrative. It transformed the departure from a simple lineup change into something far more significant, a statement about creative freedom, about the courage to redefine oneself, and about the willingness to step away from something legendary in order to build something new. And once you view it through that lens, the split takes on a different meaning. It's no longer just a dramatic moment in rock history. It becomes a reflection of what happens when ambition outgrows collaboration. It becomes a reminder that even the most iconic partnerships are still shaped by human desires, evolving goals, and the constant pull between unity and individuality. The music remains, the legacy endures, but the story behind the departure adds depth to everything that came before, and everything that followed at the end. The reason feels almost simple, yet profoundly impactful. He left to be completely free. Free to experiment. Free to expand. Free to shape his destiny without limitation. And that single motivation, stripped of rumor and exaggeration, explains why one of rock's most electrifying eras came to a sudden close, and why the decision still echoes through music history today. But the story didn't stop with the decision itself. It only became more complicated as time began to reveal the consequences. The moment David Lee Roth stepped away from Van Halen, the spotlight didn't dim, it intensified. Every move he made was scrutinized, every performance compared, every success weighed against what he had left behind. There was no safety net, no shared identity to absorb the pressure. Now, the responsibility rested entirely on his shoulders, and the world was watching closely to see whether the gamble would pay off or collapse under its own ambition. That kind of pressure can either silence an artist or ignite them, and in Roth's case, it seemed to do both at different moments, creating a narrative filled with triumphs, risks, and unexpected turns at the same time. The band itself faced its own challenge. Without the flamboyant frontman who had helped define their image, they were forced to reintroduce themselves, not just musically, but culturally. Fans debated endlessly. Was the magic in the voice, the attitude, the guitar, or the combination of all of it? It became more than a lineup change. It became a test of identity. And as both sides moved forward, the separation revealed something deeper, that the success they once shared had been built on a delicate balance of opposites. Remove one element, and the entire equation changed. For Roth, freedom meant exploration. He leaned into theatrical performances, elaborate concepts, and a style that blurred the line between rock concert and spectacle. It was bold, sometimes unpredictable, and undeniably personal. He was no longer just a frontman. He was the architect of his own narrative. That autonomy, the very thing he had sought, came with both excitement and uncertainty. Without compromise, there was also no buffer. Every idea succeeded or failed on its own merit, and that level of exposure transformed his career into something far more individual than anything he had experienced before. Meanwhile, the public perception continued to evolve. Some saw his departure as an act of courage, a declaration of artistic independence. Others viewed it as a risky move driven by ambition. But over time, the narrative shifted again, becoming less about right or wrong and more about inevitability. The personalities involved were simply too strong, the visions too distinct, to coexist indefinitely. And in that sense, the departure began to feel less like a rupture and more like a natural progression, an unavoidable moment where paths diverged because they were meant to. There's also an underlying irony that makes the story even more compelling. The very qualities that made Roth indispensable, his confidence, his theatricality, his desire to push boundaries, were the same qualities that eventually led him to leave. He wasn't rejecting success. He was redefining it. He didn't want to repeat what had already worked. He wanted to discover what else was possible. And in doing so, he transformed the narrative from one of conflict into one of evolution. As years passed, the mythology surrounding the split only grew stronger. Interviews hinted at tension. Retrospectives offered new interpretations, and fans continued to debate the real reason behind it all. Yet the simplest explanation remained the most accurate. He wanted total creative control. Not partial influence, not shared direction. Complete ownership of his artistic future. That clarity, once understood, strips away the drama and reveals something almost philosophical about the decision. It wasn't just about leaving the band. It was about choosing independence over certainty, and that choice carries a timeless resonance. In every creative field, there comes a moment when collaboration and individuality collide. Some choose stability, others choose risk. Roth chose risk, fully aware that it could redefine everything. And in that moment, he didn't just leave a band. He changed the trajectory of his own legacy, proving that sometimes the boldest move is walking away from what already works. So when you look back now, the departure doesn't feel like chaos. It feels like intention. A calculated leap into the unknown, driven by the belief that artistic freedom was worth more than guaranteed success. And once you see it that way, the story becomes less about division and more about transformation, a turning point where one of rock's most iconic figures decided that the only reason that mattered was the freedom to be completely, unapologetically himself. And even after the years passed and the headlines faded, the question continued to echo, was it really worth it? Walking away from something legendary is never just a career move. It's a statement, a risk, a gamble that reshapes everything that follows. For David Lee Roth, that gamble meant embracing a future where success would no longer be shared, where the highs and lows would belong entirely to him. There would be no collective identity to soften the impact of failure, no unified front to carry the weight of expectation. Yet that was exactly the point. He didn't want safety. He wanted authorship over his own story, even if that meant facing uncertainty head-on. Meanwhile, the shadow of Van Halen lingered over everything. Every comparison felt inevitable. Every new song, every live performance, every creative decision seemed measured against what once existed. It was as if the past refused to loosen its grip, constantly reminding audiences of what had been lost and what was still unfolding. But over time, something interesting began to happen. The split stopped feeling like a break and started feeling like two parallel narratives, each evolving in its own way. Roth's path became louder, more theatrical, more experimental, an extension of the personality fans had always associated with him. The band's path leaned into musical refinement, proving that their identity extended beyond one individual, that there's a deeper emotional layer beneath all of this, one that often gets overlooked in the drama of rock history. Creative partnerships, especially ones built on intense chemistry, carry a kind of unspoken bond. Years of touring, recording, and building a legacy together don't disappear overnight. Even when paths diverge, the shared history remains, influencing decisions and shaping perceptions long after the separation. For Roth, leaving meant carrying that history while simultaneously trying to step beyond it. It's a delicate balance, honoring the past without being defined by it. Retrospectives emerged and interviews revisited the moment. The narrative slowly matured. What once looked like conflict began to resemble clarity. The personalities involved were simply too driven, too ambitious, to remain locked in a single direction forever. And in that sense, the departure became less about disagreement and more about evolution. Roth wasn't rejecting the band. He was embracing a version of himself that required independence. That distinction is subtle but crucial, because it reframes a decision not as a rupture, but as a transformation. Another layer of irony also reveals itself over time. The very unpredictability that defined Roth's stage presence mirrored the unpredictability of his career choice. He built his reputation on surprise, spontaneity, and boldness. So when the moment came to make a decision, he did exactly what his persona suggested he would do. He chose the unexpected path. He stepped away from certainty and into possibility. And that consistency between character and action is what makes the story feel almost inevitable in hindsight. What truly stands out, though, is how simple the